Well, to look at the week in federal politics, I'm joined now by two colleagues from the Parliamentary Press Gallery. Gloria Galloway writes for the Globe and Mail, and Jordan Press is a political reporter with the Canadian Press. Both of you, thanks for coming in.
Thanks for having us.
I want to start with a subject which I didn't deal with my MPs, but which is a really fascinating one, and that is a rollout of a program that caught a lot of attention this week. Environment Minister Catherine McKenna had a press conference announcing that up to $12 million was going to be given to Loblaws Corporation to buy a few hundred new energy-efficient refrigerators. And this is all part of an energy efficiency program. But of course, this politically ended up being quite a liability. Any thoughts on the program, the announcement, or anything, Jordan?
Well, I think that the first thing is if you're going to hand out some money, maybe you don't want to do it for a major corporation that has a whole lot of revenue attached to it. It just doesn't, it sounds very tone deaf for a party and for a government that talks about trying to help the middle class and those working hard to join it, and particularly those in lower income brackets for all that they have done, and trying to take shots at other parties for saying you don't want to help them. So rolling this out does not necessarily help your brand in some ways. In other ways, it may also connect you to the brand of the Ontario Liberals that were tied to the rebate program they gave, for instance, for electric vehicles, where it ended up being that they were giving money away to wealthy people who could actually afford higher end vehicles. So all in all, it didn't seem like a very smart decision to make to roll this out this week.
The Weston family,
Yeah,
one of
I
the
was
richest
just going to
families.
say, giving $12 million to a company that's associated with one of the richest families in Canada.
$800 million of profits
It was, you know, if you'd gone and tried to figure out what the Conservatives would just love the Liberals to do in the lead up to the next election, that was brilliant. It was all over the Conservative blogosphere, and for good reason. I mean, you just have to wonder who is writing the lines there at Liberal Communications. Who thought up this?
And the interesting thing was that it's a program of which they chose 50 winners because of their submissions of ways they were going to cut energy use. It's an energy efficiency program. 50 different companies or enterprises were chosen, but the one they chose to showcase was one of the larger, richer, more successful ones. So it begs the question.
So I don't know anything about this except to surmise what might have happened.
Yeah.
And what might have happened is said, okay, pick something from the list. I don't know. There's a Loblaws just down the street. You know,
Yeah.
McKenna, why don't you go down there and you can do your PR work there? I mean, it was handy, convenient, and dumb.
How much does this hurt the overall attempt to sell the government's environment change or climate change programs?
Well, it doesn't help
No.
at all, because now suddenly everybody's talking about Loblaws, and maybe next they're going to start talking about, well, why is it, Catherine McKenna, you keep doing announcements at Canadian Tire? Why is it that you went on a tour about the climate change incentive and went to H&R Blocks in every city that you hit? And suddenly there is a question about, why is it that you seem to be very cozy with these large corporations and not necessarily talking about, well, how are you going to help the little guy or the small, medium-sized business on the corner?
And you'd say that, okay, it's too far away from the election for people to be remembering this in October. But you know what? There's somebody in Conservative headquarters who's written this down, and it's going to be coming back.
There's other big, I mean, the debate, it was immediately linked by the Conservatives to the kind of emissions exemptions that they've been given to, for example, like the Belladune power plant in New Brunswick, which gets a 95% emissions reduction because they're trying not to have, you know, heavy industry put out of business in terms of the United States. But that's also been something that has been linked in terms of the criticizing the carbon plan. Let's look at something I know both of you are looking at, and both of you have strong opinions on. That is the Budget Implementation Act. This is a government that promised not to have too much to load up omnibus budget implementation bills. A lot of things in this BIA, including changes to, well, first of all, Jordan, you turned up something that a lot of us didn't see in the Budget Implementation Act. It was
So there were two things that were in the act that I had heard was likely to be there, and one thing that I didn't expect. So the first that we expected was the housing strategy, that the National Housing Strategy that the Liberals unveiled. It's now worth about $55 billion over the next 10 years with some extra money that's been thrown in. So in the Budget Implementation Act, there is actually a right to housing piece in that strategy that is going to be legislated into law. Now, housing advocates had been concerned that this was going to happen because now their concern is, well, can we amend this a little bit to make sure that we actually can have people claim their rights in some ways, make sure there's proper oversight? This is now a much more difficult task for them with it being in a budget bill because it's buried in 392 pages. There's also an anti-poverty legislation that is in there, and the only explanation I could get from the minister on this was, well, we had to introduce it here, even though there is a separate bill about it, because this is more robust than the bill. But now it's going to pass because the other ones won't.
The other thing, I wanted you to mention that because that's a very substantial thing that's been written into the act. But the other thing, obviously, too, were the refugee changes to asylum seekers regulations. That's caught a lot of attention this week because the opposition is saying these are things you said were working perfectly, and yet you've now implemented or introduced in the Budget Implementation Act a fairly major change.
Yeah, the refugees certainly seems like an about-face from where they've been. And I'm sure the Conservatives would have loved to have talked about that. I think the NDP was somewhat aghast that they were there and wasn't given an opportunity and won't be given an ample opportunity because it's contained in this budget bill to fully debate it. Now you might say, okay, well we've got an election coming up. We need to get it passed. It would be very difficult at this point to introduce standalone legislation that would make it all the way through the House. Yeah. But is that really the way we do politics in Canada, to jam all kinds of things into a big budget bill that have nothing to do with the budget just so that we can get it out the door before an election without proper oversight, without proper committee attention, without proper MP attention? If that's the way we do business in Canada and politics in Canada, I'm not sure it's a really, well, I have to say it sounds kind of anti-democratic. And in fact, the Liberals would have said it was anti-democratic 4 years ago when they were in the lead up to an election promised never to introduce omnibus budget bills again.
But the interesting point is the need to bring it in too, because this is, as you say, in a way it contradicts what we've heard from them for 3 years, and that is, no, we've got things are in order, we've got the immigration system and the refugee claimant system working, and now all of a sudden a major change, which would mean that refugee claimants who haven't have put a refugee claim in another jurisdiction would not get a hearing here. Jordan, what do you make of it?
Well, there's a good question about why this government decided they need to put it into a budget bill. I'm just going because. Yeah. If you knew that there was a problem, this is not something that you would have just come up on a whim and said, well, let's just throw it into the budget. If you knew that there was a problem and you were considering this, you could have introduced this legislation much earlier, which says something maybe potentially about this government and how it plans things, that it doesn't really think far ahead. I mean, picking up on what we just talked about with Loblaws, it doesn't really see maybe the big picture sometimes. So by implementing this, now what you're going to have is a whole lot of people raising concerns, the fact that you're probably not going to have a lot of amendments. The place where this might actually get some amendments is in the Senate when they start splitting up this bill to take a look at it. But even then, will they decide to stick their backups and say, we need to pull this out? Or will Jeff Regan, the speaker, say, you know what, this has to come out because this is out of order?
Yeah. You know, I've been around here long enough that I think, even without having got the backroom goods on what happened here is that this refugee thing is really kind of not in the Liberal wheelhouse, for the want of a better word. This is not something that they're prone to do. This doesn't seem like very Liberal policy in any way, but somebody's seen the polls. Somebody's seen the polls in advance of the election, gone, you know what, Canadians are concerned about illegal border crossers, and this is something that they can say, look, we've taken steps to change things. But they've done it in an omnibus budget bill, which is something they said they wouldn't do.
And the other thing is that there are suggestions that this will be challenged in the courts almost immediately, because a lot of suggestions that is violating a principle enshrined in the Supreme Court ruling, the Singh ruling, about that everyone has the right to have a full hearing and challenge the decision of arbitration on immigration.
Yeah, but by that point, once that starts, the Liberals will already have made this promise. I've already said it, and it seems like it was a promise very much made to Quebec, very much made to those Quebec voters who are concerned about all those irregular migrants coming across the border, the money that has been provided to some of the people. This seems like it's very much directed at Quebec and very much directed at the voters there because, like Gloria said, they've probably seen the polls and are nervous about losing seats in that province.
Yeah. Okay, let's wrap up with something that everyone seems very keen, as the weekend, very keen on speaking about, and that is the Ontario budget. I mean, I've never seen federal politicians more rapidly jumping into the fray on an Ontario budget. Jordan.
Well, it just seems like they have wanted to make sure that they could show a difference between themselves and Doug Ford, almost run against Doug Ford in Ontario.
This is the Liberals.
The federal Liberals run against Doug Ford in Ontario and try and tie Doug Ford to Andrew Scheer. And so that is exactly what they wanted to do. And so that's why you saw 2 MPs going down to Toronto yesterday. That's why even before the budget, you had someone like Adam Vaughan going out making Simpsons references, no less, in his comments about Doug Ford. They would really like to make sure that Ontario voters, particularly those in the GTA, look at the ballot and don't just necessarily see Andrew Scheer, but they see Doug Ford as well. And that's why you're probably going to see them talking more and more about this as the days go on. And why you're going to see online the I think it's the Doug Ford or Ford's Cuts Hurt hashtag that they have been using just to get that point
And this
across.
is federal Liberals, yeah.
Yeah,
Gloria.
we're far enough away, I think, from the Harper government that it's very difficult for them to go back and say, look, this is what Conservatives did, to point out anything that they disagreed with the Conservatives. So at this point, you know, Ford is their shooting ground, right?
Yeah.
And especially, we've had negative stories about the Ford government, how it's going to cut class sizes, how it's going to delist medical health services. These are all kinds of things that people who might tend to vote Liberal are scared of, wouldn't want to hear. And if you can tie Andrew Scheer to Doug Ford, well, then you've actually done a mastery of Liberal politicking.
But the irony is that while this is going on in Alberta, every single reference from Jason Kenney is tying Rachel Notley to Justin Trudeau. So you have out west, you have Trudeau is being the lead weight that's put around Rachel Notley's neck, or some would argue, and here is the federal Liberals using or trying to use Doug Ford as a negative for Andrew Scheer. Are you watching for the Alberta results? What happens when we see what happens in Alberta?
Well, I'd be prepared to make a prediction right now about what's going to happen in Alberta, but I'm not going to.
Okay. All right. No, actually, you know what? I know I won't even press you because we get into enough trouble forcing journalists to prognosticate and to make predictions and all that. But we will watch with great interest. We'll have coverage of it next Tuesday in the Alberta election. I want to thank both of you for coming in and sharing your thoughts.
Well, thanks so much for having us on.